Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our kickoff for our fall semester of Capital Kids programs, if you will. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. And we're so excited that so many of you have taken time out of your busy day, your busy class days, to join us for this discussion of secret Washington, D.C. Before we get started, just a little bit of technical housekeeping. One of the ways we love to use this Zoom webinar platform to reach people across the country and around the world is through these webinars with question and answer at the end of each presentation. So if you have questions if you have questions for our wonderful scholar JoAnn Hill during today's program, you can put those questions into the Q&A section of the webinar platform that looks like two speech bubbles either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what kind of device you're using to join us today. And I know that a number of you who are joining us are classrooms full of great students from around the country. So if you're sending in a classroom question, if you're sending in a student question, please add that to the question when you type it in so Jane can see that properly in the Q&A. Now, if you have any technical difficulties, if you think you're having any trouble seeing us or hearing us during the course of today's program, you can go ahead and put those comments into the chat section of the webinar and I'll respond to them in real time. Once again, any troubleshooting can go into the chat. Any questions for Ms. Hill can go into the Q&A. It's now also my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, to start today's program. Jane?
Thank you so much, Sam. We appreciate the work that you do to bring these webinars to life. We also appreciate the work that Donna Sparkley, our education specialist, has done for these particular series of webinars. This series called Capital Kids is unique because we know that many of our listeners are students in classrooms, and we want you to know that any questions you have take priority over questions anybody else has. So when, whether it's students or teachers that type in, if you say, I'm from a classroom, we will move that up to the top of the list, as Sam described. Let me tell you about the person who is here with us today. JoAnn Hill has lived in Washington, D.C. with her husband Thalamus and dog Jackson for 19 years. She's an avid traveler and a foodie, and she has a blog about her travel adventures. Her writing has been published in a number of different magazines. She served as a D.C. public school teacher for 17 years before she co-founded Capital Teachers, a tutoring company that services the greater D.C. area. Her very first book is what we're going to talk about today, called Secret Washington. And this book takes a little different look at Washington. You know, Washington's known for our powerful government, our majestic monuments, world-renowned museums, but author JoAnn Hill takes Secret Washington, D.C. is a guide to the weird, wonderful, and obscure, to remind us that the fabric of the city isn't solely embedded in its political parties, its lawmaking policies, or its rampant tourism. Rather, it's woven through its rich and complex history, the mysterious relics of that history, the underground societies, forgotten and abandoned buildings, and controversial scandals. From the assassinations of President Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield and Francis Scott Key's son, to crimes of passion and rage at the U.S. Capitol, Secret Washington, D.C. uncovers many of the dark and untold truths of how our nation emerged. At the same time, it shines a bright light on the Capitol's numerous signs of creativity and innovation through the exploration of quirky art exhibits like Foamhenge and Barbie Pond on Avenue Q, to the oddly shaped and decorated homes like the Mushroom House and Vanadu Art House. That being said, it is my honor to present to you the author for today, JoAnn Hill. Hello, JoAnn. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, thank you so much, Jane. What a wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for having me today. I'm very, very excited to be here. As Jane mentioned, I am a former teacher. I taught in DC Public Schools for 17 years. I taught third grade for the majority of my career and fourth grade for 5 years. And I taught pretty close to the Capitol. I taught at Brent Elementary, which is only a few blocks away from the US Capitol. So we would take a lot of field trips over to the Capitol and nearby Supreme Court and other wonderful institutions. And so I'm really excited to be here, be able to share my knowledge and my book and some fun stories and so forth with so many classrooms and kids. So thank you again for having me. So as Jane mentioned, I am the author of this book, Secret Washington, DC, A Guide to the Weird, Wonderful, and Obscure. And to add on a little bit, in the sense of I taught a lot about DC when I was a third grade teacher. I would teach about the monuments and the memorials and their history and different neighborhoods of DC. And so when I started researching this book, I had a really good foundation and a nice background because I knew a lot about DC and I'd lived here for so long, right? About 20 years or so. But what was fun was that I also found some really kind of off the beaten path places and unknown stories and histories and some kind of dark, as Jane mentioned, but also some really lighthearted and touching and really meaningful stories that really helped me kind of learn even more about DC. So it's a good reminder that even if you're really, really, knowledgeable or familiar with something, whether it's a topic or a place or a sport or art or so forth, there's always room to grow and always so much to learn more about it, which is what brought me to this book. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second so that you can see where I am. Okay. Here we go. Well, Capitol Kids, thank you again for having me. Let's get started. So one of the first stories that I kind of uncovered and that I wanted to share with you all is the story about the boundary stones. You might be familiar with this. If you are into geocaching or exploring, or you're an adventurous in any way, then I think that you'll really enjoy learning a little bit more about the boundary stones, and you can visit the boundary stones as well. The boundary stones, as you see, this is one of the 40. There are about 40 rocks that were placed as markers to create the boundary of DC. So you may know that DC is pretty much the size of a diamond or a rhombus that is enveloped by Virginia and Maryland. Well, many, many, many years ago in the 1790s, of course, that boundary hadn't been established yet. And so Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, he later then, of course, became our third president, he decided that he was going to hire individuals to help create this boundary or the perimeter of Washington, D.C. He hired a major called, his name was Andrew Ellicott. Andrew Ellicott then hired an individual named Benjamin Banneker. You might be familiar with him. A lot of things are named after Benjamin Banneker. There's Banneker High School and so forth. He was an astronomer. He was a surveyor. He had a lot of different roles. He and his team started plotting out the boundary of DC together. And so a couple years later in 1794, the first stone was set at the very southern tip at Jones Point in Alexandria, Virginia. And you can see on this map that it's kind of identified or labeled with that red star. That was the very first stone. You can visit that stone. It's in a case that's held very securely. So you can see that first stone. And from there then, all of the stones were set. And as I mentioned, there are about 40 altogether. Now, of course, many years later, fast forward, right? Well over 200 years later, the boundary and the perimeter of DC has changed quite a bit. So these stones now aren't always really placed at the actual boundary because the boundaries have shifted. And so you can find these stones, and some of them are in people's front yards. Some of them are in forests and parks on sidewalks. So they're kind of now in kind of very odd, quirky, obscure places. But there is a website, if you Google boundary stones of DC, there's a website that actually marks the location of all 40 or nearly 40 stones that you can visit. And on the stones, they have certain engravings, one including the date that that stone was placed, but also including one side of whether it's helping on the side of Maryland or the side of Virginia, it will also indicate that state as well. And so those are the boundary stones. You'll notice on each slide that I mentioned in the corner, kind of the pages where this entry is set. So you'll see like pages 140 and 141, just to kind of give you a little bit of reference. All right. So now that we know how the city and how the boundary of DC was established, let's go into our next story. Of course, we have to go to the US Capitol. There are a couple different stories of the US Capitol that are in my book. There are about 3. This was the one that I chose to share with you all. You might know this statue. This statue is called the Portrait Monument. It is located in the Rotunda, along with many other famous statues and famous paintings. The Rotunda, if you haven't been, is incredible. I've visited many times with my kids on field trips. But this statue that you see right here, the Portrait Monument, wasn't always in the Rotunda. And that's the story that I want to share with you. This statue was sculpted by an artist. Her name was Adelaide Johnson. She was a very famous sculptor. And if you look at this statue, there are 3 women that I want to talk about, as well as another part of the statue that I also want to talk about. She created this statue to commemorate women's suffrage, was basically in the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment essentially gave white women the right to vote. And I say white women because at that point, not everybody had the right to vote. The 19th Amendment did give women the right to vote, but it's very important to distinguish that these were white women at the time. So these 3 women were the pioneers. They were 3 of the leading women who were really crusaders who helped establish and helped get this 19th Amendment passed. So we have Susan B. Anthony, we have Lucretia Mott, and we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So these 3 women are here. Now you might notice in the back, there's kind of this uncarved lump, right? And so there are a lot of historians and tour guides and so forth that share the same theory, that that lump was actually left uncarved on purpose. That Adelaide Johnson intentionally left that lump unfinished because she wanted to say, while women had come a long way at that point in terms of being given the right to vote, women still had a long way to go. And so this was kind of her way of saying, our work here is not done. And she wanted that statue to represent that. Well, fast forward, shortly after, this amazing statue was removed from the rotunda and was actually placed in the broom closet of the US Capitol in the basement. It was in the broom closet of the basement of the US Capitol for 75 years. That's a really, really long time. So from 1920, 75 years later, in 1995, a group of women, some congresswomen and other individuals decided we need to move this statue and put it back into the rotunda where it belongs. They raised about $75,000 to move this statue. So you can imagine how big and how heavy the statue is. It took about $75,000 to finally transport it back into the rotunda where it is today that you can visit. And so I think about Adelaide Johnson and her thought of women still have a very long way to go. And you think about, she was right? The fact that this statue was kind of removed and hidden, and it took so long, right? Over 7 decades to finally bring it back to the rotunda where it belongs. So that's the Portrait Monument. I hope you all get a chance to see it. It's a stunning statue. A quick note too, if you are familiar with the Capitol Hill area, I know that's where my school was, in the US Capitol, Congressional Cemetery, which is in Capitol Hill. It's a very famous cemetery. There are a lot of important individuals, some vice presidents and so forth. Adelaide Johnson, the woman who created this statue, the sculptor, she's buried there. So just to kind of give you an idea. All right, we go back, staying in Capitol Hill. So this sign, you might know it. It's called Capitolosaurus Court. And it is around 1st and F Street Southeast. You might know Garfield Park. There are tennis courts there. It's a great playground, and it's very close to my school and very close to the US Capitol. Well, the reason why it's called Capitolosaurus Court is in 1898, a very long time ago, well over 100 years ago, a dinosaur fossil was discovered by workers. These workers were installing a sewer pipe and they found this fossil. Researchers at the Smithsonian Institution, which you're probably familiar with, identified it as Creosaurus potens, which is a pretty fancy word, huh? Which was basically a 30-foot long predator that exceeded 2.5 tons. That's over 4,000 pounds. That's about 4,500 pounds. It's a really, really, really big dinosaur. Well, over 100 years later, a paleontologist is someone who studies dinosaurs and fossils and so forth, by the name of Peter Krantz, he decided to come up with a little bit more of a snazzier word that was a little bit more fun and gave this dinosaur the name Capitolosaurus because, you know, dinosaur in Capitol Hill and so forth. Peter Krantz also worked with kids just like you from a few DC public schools, from Watkins Elementary and Smothers Elementary. They worked hard together, I should say, to name the fossil Capitolosaurus. So it was Peter Krantz's kind of idea to rename, and the kids, along with Peter Krantz, also worked together. The kids created a song that you can Google and find about this dinosaur fossil. In 1998, about 100 years later after the dinosaur fossil was discovered, they helped designate it as DC's official dinosaur, which is pretty cool. Now, of course, if you want to find or you want to look at that fossil, you can visit the Museum of Natural History where it is today. So that's a really cool story. I think it's super fun that, I mean, you don't think about dinosaur fossils being found that easily or that readily in a city like DC. All right, let's keep going. This is one of my favorite stories in my book. And to give you an idea, just when I say that, there are 84 stories or entries in my book, which is quite a bit. And of course, I love all of them. I wrote all of them, but like anything, you have some that kind of you gravitate towards or some that might be your favorite for different reasons. And this is definitely one of my favorites. It's just a really good, feel-good story. So you might see this carousel and be familiar with it, right? This is the carousel. It's very famous. It's on the National Mall. But what's interesting is that this carousel was not always on the National Mall. It originally was at an amusement park called Gwen Oak Amusement Park, which was right outside of Baltimore. So a little less than an hour drive away from Washington. So this carousel was there. And the reason why this carousel has so much significance and so much historical meaning is that on the same day that Dr. Martin Luther King gave his speech, I Have a Dream, that was on August 28th, 1963, that same day, this amusement park, Gwen Oak, banned segregation, meaning it was the first day that African Americans and white individuals could be on rides together. On this particular day, an 11-month-old baby, her name is Sharon Langley, she's still living, she was African American. She rode on the carousel with 2 white children. And so it was the first time this had ever happened. And I thought how incredible that not only did this happen, but it happened on the day that Dr. King gave his famous speech. Many years later, in the early 1980s, this carousel was purchased by individuals and brought over to the National Mall where it is today. When they brought this carousel over to the mall, they didn't actually know this history or the story. Years later, that story and that history was discovered. And so if you go to the carousel now, on the side, the back of the side that faces the Arts and Industries building, the Smithsonian building, there's a little gold plaque that gives a little bit of history and it commemorates that historical moment in 1963. Another thing is that Sharon Langley, the 11-month-old baby who rode on the carousel, she's now in her 60s, she's a grown adult. She has written a book called A Ride to Remember about her time and that moment on the carousel that you can, it's a picture book. I read it to my kids in class. So it's a wonderful book, but it's just, I feel like it's a very feel-good story. And one more thing is that if you think about the carousel and its location on the National Mall, that's not too far from where Dr. King delivered his speech over by the Lincoln Memorial. So it's also very fitting that it kind of ended up in a spot pretty nearby. So that's, again, one of my favorite stories. Okay. So I included this story because, as you know, I love working and talking with kids. And last year, I think, or maybe, yeah, I think last summer, I talked to a Girl Scout troop about my book and I shared different stories. And this was their favorite story, which sometimes stories and favorites surprise you, right? As an author, I told you I have some of the ones that, I feel are kind of like my favorites, or, I like to share. And when I talk to other people, it's really interesting. Sometimes they share favorites that I have, and sometimes they have other favorites. Well, this group of young women, they loved this story. So I thought, well, clearly I had to share it with you too. So if we go over now across the city to Northwest DC in Columbia Heights, there is a park, Meridian Hill Park, or it's also known as Malcolm X Park. And this famous statue that you can see, the Joan of Arc statue, stands there today. It's a really beautiful, majestic statue. Joan of Arc, which is this young girl you see here holding this sword, is riding a horse. And so Joan of Arc, just to give you a very brief background of who she was a teenage girl who led a French army, which is pretty incredible. She was a teenager. I believe she was around 14 or so. She led this French army to victory. They won during the 100 Years' War during the 1400s. So many, many, many centuries ago, many, many, many years ago. Well, the reason why this story made my book, and my kids, the girls I talked to, loved it, is that this sword that you see her holding has been stolen 3 separate times. Now, this sword, to give you an idea, it weighs about 30 pounds. And it's about 5 feet tall. So it's a pretty big and pretty sizable sword, meaning you would think it'd be hard to remove and hard to steal. However, on 3 very separate occasions, this sword was stolen. Well, before I tell you about the stealings, to give you an idea, this statue was gifted by a French women's group in 1922. So we're in 2022, so exactly 100 years ago, a French women's group gifted this statue to Washington, D.C. Well, about 10 years later, in 1932, the sword was removed for the very first time. They never found out who did it, but it wasn't completely lost. It was found in some bushes, and the sword was kind of bent. So it was kind of damaged, but it wasn't so bad. It was still intact, but they were able to put it back. And so it was there. Well, fast forward over 40 years ago, right? About 46 years ago or so. In 1978, the sword was stolen again. So because so much time had passed, you have to think they weren't related, right? They weren't the same people. This sword was stolen again, and this time it was stolen for a long time. It was kind of lost, right? It wasn't replaced until 2011, right? Roughly 30 years or so. Finally, it was replaced, only to be stolen for a 3rd time in 2016. At that point, in 2016, if you think about it, wasn't that long ago. It was only about 6 years ago. This sword then was stolen for this 3rd time. And finally, people started thinking, what is going on with this sword? What's happening? Well, Eleanor Holmes Norton, she's a representative for DC. She finally kind of talked or called up the National Park Service and said, clearly some efforts can be made to protect Joan of Arc's sword, right? We have to be better, and we have to be able to protect this sword. Well, a couple of years later in 2018, money was raised. You might know the History Channel. You might know Lifetime Network. They're both big networks on television. They together, and I'm sure other organizations too, raised about $18,000 to restore and replace her sword. And so fingers crossed, her sword is still there. You can visit it. And hopefully, as we can see, it's been protected for the last 6 years. So hopefully we won't have repeat and it won't be stolen again. One thing that I learned, or that I discovered when I was researching this story, if you remember back to the portrait monument that I shared where Adelaide Johnson created the statue for the women's suffragists, and she said women still have a long way to go. Well, to give you an idea, according to the Lifetime Network, they were one of the TV networks that raised money for the sword. There are only about 200 historical statues of women throughout the country. So if you think about how many statues there are, that's a really, really low number. Now, this was as of a couple of years ago, so that may have increased, but it's still a relatively, or not relatively, it's still a really low number. So I wanted to just kind of make that connection. Okay, I'm checking time. Here we go. This is another one of my favorites, and I know I keep saying that, but it is true. So you have probably walked by call boxes many, many times when you're walking throughout DC. Doesn't matter where you are in DC. It could be in Southeast, Southwest, Northeast, Northwest. These call boxes, and these are a couple of examples, they were basically used many years ago as like phone systems and call systems for emergencies. So before there were cell phones, before there were pay phones, you may or may not know what they are, there were these call boxes. And basically, if there was a fire or there was some kind of emergency, you could go to these call boxes and contact someone in case of emergency. Well, of course, these call boxes no longer work. They are inoperable. There are well over hundreds all throughout the city. Most of them, they're made of cast iron. Some of them are not as attractive as these. Some of them are kind of decaying and rusty and so forth, but some are beautiful and have been turned into art and historical markers. And that's what I want to talk about with this group of call boxes. So these call boxes are located downtown. They honor women throughout history, and they all have a connection with DC, right? They've either lived in DC, or these women were born in DC, or they've worked in DC. So some kind of connection to Washington. A couple of years ago, a group of historians and artists came together and said, we want to transform, or we want to kind of change these call boxes to honor women throughout history. And so their plan was to honor 9 women. They ended up honoring 8 only because they lost funding for the 9th. These call boxes, like I said, are downtown. They're all around the White House area. So they're anywhere between about 13th and 15th Streets Northwest, between G and L Northwest. So if you walk around like Metro Center and the White House, there's a very good chance that you will see some of these call boxes. These are only 3 of the call boxes out of the 8. And you can see they are beautiful. Each call box has a picture of the woman, her name, her year, her date of birth, and the date that she passed away. And also either on the side or the back is a little plaque, like almost like you would see at a museum, that gives you a little bit of description about the women's history and her contribution to history. And so the ones that you see on screen, Katharine Graham, that's the one on the very top left-hand corner. She was a famous publisher for the Washington Post, which we know is one of the biggest newspapers in the country, if not the world. Josephine Butler, who's in the corner. She was a seamstress. She would sew clothes, and she was an activist. And I'm sorry, wrong person. Backtrack. Josephine Butler, was a social reformer. She fought for women's right to vote, and she fought for women's right to receive education. Elizabeth Keckley, this callback that you see in the light purple, the lilac, she was the seamstress. She would sew, and she was such a great seamstress that she was able to buy her and her son's freedom. They were slaves. She was able to purchase their freedoms. They were no longer slaves. One of the reasons also, this beyond being a seamstress, that she's well known to is that she was Mary Todd Lincoln, the first lady of Abraham Lincoln, his wife. She was her seamstress and very good friend. There's another call box of a woman named Mary Church Terrell, who you may have heard of. She was very well known. She was a former teacher. She taught Latin at the school that's now known as Dunbar High School. She was a huge activist. She fought for integration. She's one of the reasons why people in Washington, D.C. can all eat together. There were restaurants who, there was segregation where African Americans couldn't eat at or how to set a different area. And she, along with many other activists, fought for restaurants to be able to serve everyone. And so Mary Church Terrell is a woman who's also honored. You might know Flora Moulton. She was a gospel singer. Artist Alma Thomas. She's pretty famous. The Obamas have had her artwork in the White House when they were in office. So lots of call boxes. If you walk around other parts of DC, you'll start to notice these call boxes. Before, maybe not, but now you definitely will. My doorbell is ringing. So if you hear some kind of ringing, I apologize. We're going to just hopefully, there we go. It stopped. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. This is another favorite because this story is just, it's kind of weird. It's kind of a weird story. If you go over to Southeast DC in Anacostia, you may have noticed this huge, enormous chair. It's called the Big Chair, which is perfectly named, right? The Big Chair, it's on the corners of, there's kind of two, like a big intersection, Martin Luther King Boulevard, and I think these streets. This enormous chair is not the original. It's a replica or a copy of the original. But the history of this chair is bananas. It's fascinating. So when it was created, it was the largest chair in the world. It no longer holds that title, but it used to be the biggest chair in the world. This was in the late 1950s. It measured 19 and a half feet tall. That's tall, right? That would be almost 4 of Joan of Arc's swords, to give you an idea. And it weighed 4,600 pounds, which is about the size of the weight of a car. Well, this chair was created to create publicity, right? They wanted to advertise for this furniture store. But the furniture store said, that's not enough. We want even more recognition. So in 1960, they hired a woman. Her name was Rebecca Kirby, to live on top of this chair. Before you're wondering, how does that happen? Well, they created a cube. It was a 3-sided cube that was pretty much not glass, but it was see-through. It was transparent. You could see through. And in this cube, they created these little kind of like living quarters. There was a bed, a bathroom, it had a shower and a toilet, a television, curtains. And this woman lived here for 42 days. That is 6 weeks. That's a long time, right? That's a month and a half, right? So if you think about school, you are not quite into your 6th week of school. So think about how long. You still have a couple more weeks, probably until your 6 weeks of school. She was also paid about $1,500, which is a lot of money. Back then, it was considered even more money, but eventually she couldn't take it anymore. She no longer lived there. And if you're wondering, how did she get up to this cube? She was brought up by a forklift, which is used a lot in construction and so forth. Pretty crazy. So that's why this story is bananas. It's a little crazy. Can you imagine something like that happening now? Well, anyway, of course, many years later, that original chair, you think about rain and weather and other things, that chair started to kind of rot or decay. So they built a replica or the copy, which that you see is today. I don't know if you can see, but there's a little plaque right on the bottom of that chair that gives a very brief history of the chair. And so it's a really cool spot. It was really fun to kind of uncover the story and the history behind it. All right. I'm looking at time and I actually think I'm right on time. This is one of the last slides I'm going to share. And this is another favorite. And again, it's just because it's a fun place and also just a feel-good place. So in Northwest DC, if you know where DuPont Circle is and Logan Circle, there is this art installation that's called Barbie Pond. So Barbie Pond, it's on Q Street Northwest between 14th and 15th Streets. It's in the front of a house in their yard. So the artists, they live there And they've created, you know, when you walk on the sidewalk in their little grass area in their front yard, they've created kind of this little pond. It's really nice. You can see there are stones and some water and greenery. And their art installation is all Barbie dolls, all Barbie dolls. And it changes about every month. So they have a different theme about once a month. Some of the themes reflect holidays. So like around Halloween and 4th of July and New Year's, you know, they'll do really fun holiday inspired so that, you know, there might be like, you know, music and lights and so forth, but they reflect sometimes holidays. Sometimes they'll reflect pop culture, like things that are going on. Sometimes they will reflect politics. And so you see here, during the election time, they had a big ballot box that said vote, right? It was helping to kind of inspire, motivate people to get out and vote. And you'll see it said, you know, the two candidates were Ken and Barbie. So they're a little playful. They also will, you know, you'll see that here, this is reflecting like summertime. And so they kind of cover lots of different seasons and themes. What I love about it, though, is that it's just a feel good. Anybody can walk by it. It's completely free. You can stand, you can see these Barbie dolls. It's so creative. It's so quirky, so fun. And also the artists have pretty much chosen to be anonymous, meaning they don't want people to really know who they are. And so even when I reached out to them to get some pictures for my book, I sent them, you know, messages and emails. I never actually spoke to them or got to meet them. They're very nice, but they choose to kind of be a little quiet and private. So, which made me wonder, when are they changing these art installations, right? Because they're pretty elaborate. They're pretty detailed. There's a lot of things going on, right? The Barbies are wearing different clothing and costumes. Sometimes they have cars, sometimes they have lights, sometimes they have music, sometimes they have pumpkins for Halloween. So there's a lot to it. And so I wonder, like, do they go out in the middle of the night when it's dark and no one's awake? Is that when they choose to change up the exhibit? I don't know. And one last story with this is that their neighbors have grown to love Barbie Pond, right? It's a big attraction. If you know Instagram, they have their own Instagram page. They're on Google Maps. They're on TripAdvisor, which is a travel website that people review different places like hotels and restaurants. But one neighbor, when he was leaving the neighborhood, he was moving out of the neighborhood to go somewhere else, he left them a box of Barbie dolls, a package with a note, and basically said, "You have given me so much joy, and you've given this neighborhood so much happiness with your artwork. And I just wanted to thank you. And I'm leaving, but thank you for giving me so many years of joy with your creativity." And so that made me very, very happy. Okay, I'm going to pause because I know I've been talking for quite a bit. I know there might be some Q&A, some questions that I'm happy to answer, hopefully have the answers. And then I'll talk a little bit more about some other things, but if we're okay, I'm okay with pausing right here.
That's great. Well, thank you, Joanne. This is such fun stories. You can see how much you love the city and love the storytelling. Couple questions we had about you referred to the French women's groups, and what was the relationship between that French women's group and the suffragists? Was there any connection? Do you know?
You know, I will be very honest. I don't know enough to really say. I can tell you the French group's name was Les Lycéennes Société des Femmes de France. And so that I know the name of the group, but I don't exactly know their exact tie or their connection or relationship. And so I'm sorry, something for me to research for sure for maybe a future book or project.
Leave it to this crowd. They always ask something complicated.
Well, or they just ask really great questions, which is what it's all about, right? So
exactly. And again, we invite you, to put your questions in. We've got a couple other questions. Tell us about the transition from being a classroom teacher to being an author.
Oh my goodness, that's another great question. So I, of course, as a teacher, I loved teaching every subject. Math and writing were by far my two favorite subjects to teach. And so in the beginning, Jane had mentioned that I travel a lot. And so I started many years ago a travel blog. And so I wrote about travels and DC and restaurant. And I really became even more invested in writing, and I practicing more. And I really found that I loved writing. It was a really nice passion. It was a great way to kind of have a creative outlet, and also to write about things that I loved. Well, I had met a woman many years ago while traveling. She lives in Texas, and we kept in touch, and she reached out to me saying that she was writing a book for where she lived in Texas. And she asked me if I would be interested in writing one because she followed my blog. And so in the beginning, it was a little scary because being a writing teacher and writing a travel blog, while it's really great practice and it really does help, of course, writing a book is a kind of a really big undertaking. It's a really big piece of work. But I met with, actually, I'll show this. I'm not going to go through it, but this kind of gives you an idea of like how I started to write or what I did in my writing process. And writers, I'm sure that you go through a lot of this the same, right? The first thing I did was, well, I don't know everything, and I know that I need to learn a lot. So I interviewed some experts. I thought about, oh, I know some tour guides. I went on walking tours, and I visited museums, and I visited people, and I talked to historians, and they gave me a lot of really great information, were super helpful. And then I started planning. I thought about, how do I teach my kids to write? And so I would brainstorm and organize ideas. I would use books and the internet. And like I said, I would go to museums. And so I had all different stories and resources. I made sure, like, I knew that I might get distracted if my phone was next to me. So I kept my phone in another room when I worked. And so I did all of these things while I worked. And so long story short is that a lot of things that I did as a teacher helped with this project and helped with this book. But it was definitely a shift. But it was, I think, having that background and being in a classroom really helped with this creative piece. I hope I answered that question.
No, that is. So you kept saying, this one's my favorite, this one's my favorite. Now, I want to put you on the spot. What is your favorite story that you identified in the book?
My favorite story. Okay, other than the carousel, because that really is like a top one or two. I wrote about spies, and the spies were super fun. So there was this story. There were two stories that I would say are probably my favorites. There was a story that actually the Supreme Court, right across from the Capitol, used to be a prison. And it was a prison that was created during the Civil War. And so there were some spies that were in prison there. And I found some female spies who were really kind of very clever, not really good people, but they were in prison there. So I thought spies, with DC, there are a lot of spies, a lot of espionage here. That was, I liked learning about spies. I would say the spies are my favorite.
Okay. Now, another question that we have. Do you know who was the president when the women's statue was moved to the broom closet, when it went into the broom closet? We know who it was when it went out.
Clinton. Who was the president in 1920?
Uh-huh.
Uh-oh. Do you know the answer, Jane?
Woodrow Wilson, I think.
Was it okay. I believe you. Oh, yes, because then in 1921, it was Warren G. Harding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to look that up.
Google's a great thing, right?
Google's a great thing, yes.
Now, did you have a specific audience in mind when you wrote this book?
That's interesting. In the beginning, I thought, oh, this is going to be like a guidebook or like a tourist guidebook that will be good for people visiting DC. But then, and I still think it is, because I think, people come to Washington and they do want to see the monuments and the memorials and museums. And I think this book gives some like fun kind of histories. Like they might want to visit the US Capitol, or they might want to visit the Supreme Court. And this gives a little bit of a different story behind it. But then I also realized the people who have kind of reached out to me the most have been people who live here, right? Who are Washingtonians who live in DC and Northern Virginia, Maryland, because I think like you, as I mentioned earlier, right? You live somewhere and you get to know it and you become familiar and you learn a lot about it. But then through this book and other ways, you find other kind of unknown stories or histories, or like, wow, I never knew about that. Or I didn't know the story. I didn't know the Supreme Court was an old prison many years ago. I didn't know that the carousel came from a park outside of Baltimore. So I feel like it's more written for the people who live here, just because they want to learn a little bit more and the histories and the secret stories. But I also made sure, because I am a former teacher and I still work with kids now in my tutoring company, that there were enough stories that were kid friendly that the kids would enjoy too. So I hate to say that it's for everyone, it is, but different stories, I had people in mind.
Different people.
Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Now, one of our other authors who's appeared on Capital Kids, Kitty Feldy, must be working on a book of her own, because she asked you, did you find any stories that were set around 1900?
Oh, 1900. So I have some stories that are in the late 1890s. Like there's a story that I have, it's a little dark, but you mentioned assassination. So one of our presidents, President Garfield in 1891, he was assassinated right outside this place, which is the National Gallery of Art now. That used to be a railroad station. It was the Potomac Baltimore station. So he was coming off the train. That was 1891. So 9 years earlier, but I have to think if I have any stories that are right in 1900. That's a little tough. I don't know about that.
That's okay. You know, just
I have a lot of stories in the Civil War era, which is of course earlier in the 1860s. Yeah, that might be the one story that I'm thinking that's close to 1900.
closest to it.
Closest to it, yeah.
Actually, Sam Holliday, our historian, just says Garfield was actually assassinated in 1881.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for correcting me. Then I
1891. So
okay. 1881, which was about 20 years earlier.
20 years before 1900.
Yeah. And then of course, the portrait monument was 20 years after 1900, right? In 1920.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know if I have any right in 1900. Some of the women who I mentioned with the call boxes, I was just looking at my notes, for example, like Josephine Butler, she was a social reformer. She was the individual who fought for women's right to vote and women's right to education. She passed away in 1906. So she lived around that time. A lot of the women who I spoke about lived around that time, but not exactly 1900.
Sure. Well, and you know, the other thing, one of our folks wrote in that something that you may be interested to know, just as you talk about this. The District of Columbia chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution has taken on a project of keeping the boundary stones clean.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I actually have that mentioned in my book about their work and keeping them clean, keeping them restored, keeping them safe, right? Like they put a lot of efforts to kind of keep them from being moved and kept where they need to be kept. I think it's been a really big undertaking, and you know, I think their fruits of their labor has been wonderful. But I think, you know, things have happened. But yes, absolutely, they are mentioned in my book for sure.
Well, they're very proud of that. So, you know, we obviously have someone who is involved with that, who's writing. You know,
it's wonderful.
You got to especially love our audience because they're full of information.
I love it. Yes.
Now, I also hear you've got another book coming that you're working on. You want to tell us about that one?
I do. So I have another book that's actually coming out in a few weeks. Here we go. It is DC Scavenger. And it's set to come out in the middle of October 15th. So in about 2 to 3 weeks. And this book is pretty different than Secret DC. Secret DC, you know, there's 84 entries and each entry has 2 pages and, you know, there's kind of like a story. DC Scavenger is a scavenger hunt around throughout the entire city of DC and only DC, whereas in Secret Washington, I have some stories in Northern Virginia and Maryland. And so DC Scavenger, it's super fun. There are 17 chapters, and each chapter is a neighborhood. And so, for example, you have Anacostia as a neighborhood. Capitol Hill is a neighborhood. DuPont Circle is a neighborhood. The National Mall I designated as a neighborhood. And each neighborhood is a scavenger hunt that you can do by itself. And so there are anywhere between, let's say, around 10 clues all the way up to about 25 clues or so. And so I highlighted 2 clues here that are in the same neighborhood. In fact, they're actually next to each other. So you would go from the first to the second. So you're going to notice each clue. And to give you an idea, there are about 350 clues in the book. Each clue is a riddle. There are 4 lines and they rhyme. I did the AABB pattern, meaning the first 2 lines, the last word rhyme, and the last 2 lines, they rhyme. And each line is anywhere between about 8 to 12 words, give or take. And so let me read the first one. It's the one in red that you can see. The highest of its kind in the land, here we learn where the famous 9 stand. Thinking of justice, she sits in thought, contemplation, balancing a supreme lot. And so there's a place, but there's a statue right in front of this place. Does anyone want to put in the chat box where you think this clue is? And if you think there's a word in the clue that points to the location, like where we are. Yes, nice job. I see Barbara.
Yep, Barbara Woodard and Melanie LaForce said the Supreme Court.
Oh yeah, there are more. Nice.
So we've got two different folks who knew the answer. It's the statue of the woman at the Supreme Court entrance, the Statue of Justice.
Oh, exactly. Nice job. All right, so that's the first clue that I shared. And now the next clue, no need to walk, just look across the way. Glance up to see the statue on display. This bronze beauty adorns this icon's round. She's free and strong, weighing 15,000 pounds. What do you think?
All right, sports fans. Do, 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 do. Barbara Woodard coming in again.
Nice work.
Share a castle.
That's exactly right. Yep, it's that freedom statue right on top of the U.S. Capitol. So awesome job. Thanks for playing along. I appreciate it. Oh my goodness, I keep doing that. Sorry about that. Hold on. Here we go. So those are just 2 examples of the riddles and the clues. And as I mentioned, they're part of the Capitol Hill neighborhood. But it's a fun book. It comes out in a couple of weeks. I think you had asked earlier, like, who was my audience? And this really is, there are clues that I think kids will love. There are clues that I think adults will love. I think this book I wrote for anyone who kind of likes to explore their city in a fun way, right? I imagine people will do it either on their own, maybe in groups, maybe with family members, maybe as a little competition. I'm running some scavenger hunts with some different teams. And so I think it's just a fun way to explore the city. And every single clue is somewhere outside. So you don't have to go inside anywhere like a museum or a business. And there's a little picture that accompanies each clue. And the picture is a picture that I took on my iPhone that's really zoomed in. So it kind of gives a little bit of a hint, but not so much that it gives it away. So that's my next book coming out. And now I'm working on a food book that comes out in a couple of years, which we don't need to talk about right now. But yeah, so DC Scavenger.
Joanne, this is so much fun. I can't wait to go on a scavenger hunt. And Barbara Woodard said to tell you that she's proud to be a history teacher, and that's why she knows all the answers.
Well, I'm super impressed, Barbara. I think that next time I'm writing a historical book, I may need to reach out to you because you clearly are a wealth of knowledge. So thank you for sharing your knowledge as well. That's wonderful.
Well, we know our folks love the stories. We've got folks who've lived in the neighborhood, suggestions that you become part of the Professional Tour Guide Association. Some of our tour guides have been listening. So we are, and Barbara says she will be happy to talk to you anytime.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you, Barbara. And for anyone else as well, I'll address, I see a question that I'll address in a second. I put my email address here, and this is the website for the book and so forth. But if you ever want to connect or reach out to me for any reason, this is my personal email address that you're, happy to correspond and connect that way. In the secret, I see a question asking about the Mary McLeod buffoon.
Right.
In this book, no. That particular Mary McLeod buffoon is not, there's another, I don't want to give it away. There's something else related to Mary McLeod buffoon in my scavenger hunt book. It's a clue that she is featured. But again, I don't want to give it away, but not in Secret DC, but in my upcoming book, yes.
Okay, well, this is great fun. Thank you very much. And to our audience, we thank you for being with us. Joanne, thank you for being with us. And we want to remind the audience that the next Capital Kids is October 25th. And the book is called Res Dogs by Dr. Joseph Barak. And for 40 years, Joseph Barak has been creating literature and music that reflects his indigenous heritage and traditions. He's a proud Nalihagan Abenaki citizen and a respected elder among his people. He's the author of more than 120 books for children and adults, a professional teller of the tales of the Adirondacks and the native peoples of the Northeast Woodlands. He's performed widely in Europe and throughout the United States, and has been storyteller in residence for Native American organizations. So his book that he wrote is really quite imaginative. It's focused for a middle school verse novel set during the COVID-19 pandemic about a Wabanakis girl's quarantine on her grandparents' reservation and the local dog who becomes her very best friend. Milan was visiting her grandparents on the reservation when the pandemic started. Now she's staying there, away from her parents and her school in Boston. Everyone is worried about the pandemics, but on the reservation, everyone protects one another. From Malian caring for her grandparents to the local dog, Maslam, guarding their house. And she hears stories from her grandparents about how it has always been this way in the community. Stories about how their ancestors survived epidemics of European diseases, about her grandfather who survived a terrible government boarding school, about Milan's own mother who survived and returned to her Native American community after social services took her away to live in foster care as a child. So it's a very interesting way to share the history of some very tough times. So we look forward to you joining us on the 25th. For those of you who are part of our regular feature, we continue our feature series on the amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Stay tuned for details about those upcoming webinars, and everyone who's on this webinar will get a thank you note that has a video of this event. So if you want to share it, you can share it with your friends and neighbors, and it will live on our website in perpetuity. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for being with us. Have a good day.